Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mollee Jakubisin. I'm an Associate Director of Client Relations here at Cision Insights, and where I oversee the insights relationship of several of our Fortune 500 clients. Before we get started today, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items just to ensure all of you have an optimal viewing experience. So you can rearrange, resize, or minimize the boxes on your screen to your liking. Feel free to adjust those as needed. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, the bottom icon on the left side of your screen opens to some troubleshooting tips, or you may also submit your issue in the question box. We will have time for an audience Q&A at the end of our webinar, so please submit your questions in the question box to the left of the media player throughout the discussion. At the bottom of your screen is a box that says, Speak to an expert, where you can let us know if you are interested in a free consultation with a Cision expert following the session. And then finally, the session is being recorded. I know there was a question about that already. All who registered will receive an on-demand video to rewatch or share with colleagues. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic, monitoring a PR crisis. Go ahead to next slide, Julien. In today's session, we will be covering the intersection of media monitoring and PR crisis management, concepts and frameworks for effective media monitoring before, during, and after a crisis, and best practices and examples. Next slide, please. We will be leading today's discussion. Like I already said, my name is Mollee Jakubisin. I'm an Associate Director of Client Relations for Cision Global Insights. In my role, I work with several Fortune 500 companies to maintain and create media monitoring practices that fit each organization's priorities.
And I'm Julien Barrientos. I'm a senior analyst for Cision Global Briefings and the former manager of Cision's executive news alerts team, where I played a key role in developing our media monitoring services for Fortune 500 clients. Back to you, Mollee.
Crisis communications is a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts, as we both started our time at Cision as alerts analysts, which, as you can probably imagine, put a special emphasis on crisis communications. So next slide, please. Just a quick overview of today's agenda before we get started. We'll discuss a proactive approach and why it matters, provide a crisis monitoring framework, go over best practices, highlight some real-world cases, and then we'll end with a quick Q&A. And next slide.
Hi, everyone. So the thrust of our presentation today is that a proactive approach towards media monitoring stands to benefit your entire enterprise in a crisis time. And so we'll begin with some general challenges involved with PR crises and media monitoring, and we'll bring it together. For the context of this presentation, we'll define a PR crisis as a costly threat to an enterprise's reputation with a short window to act. Not all crises have a reputational dimension, but most do, and we'll focus on this being a presentation towards PR professionals. Now, in terms of the challenges, accelerated news cycles across traditional media have been a feature of the media landscape for many decades now, and it's only increasing, especially in terms of COVID-era news coverage. As well, we have the additional function of social media, which amplifies news, regardless of its veracity, at a faster rate than ever before. We also see an interaction between traditional media and social media. Sometimes traditional news media gets picked up and disseminated via social media, and conversely, sometimes statements made on social media generate traditional news coverage. So it's a multi-dimensional challenge that PR professionals have to navigate. The other half of the equation here is media monitoring, which we're defining as the collection and analysis of news coverage and social media posts. Related to accelerated news cycles, we also see fragmented media environments where the concept of a single national source of truth doesn't exist anymore. There are many different pockets of news media consulted by different audiences, and this needs to be factored into any media monitoring solution. Related to social media amplification, there's the disaggregated nature of social media. For comparison, think about Bloomberg, for instance, or the Wall Street Journal, high quality publications that aggregate a great deal of information collected by journalists, go through a robust editorial process, and finish with a final polished product. That's not usually the case on social media, where anyone can have a voice, and determining whose voices are relevant for your business needs is more important than ever. This also poses opportunities and challenges. Opportunities to identify advocates, people who can speak to your communications key messages, as well as identifying those who detract from those key messages. So, having discussed some general challenges of PR crises and media monitoring, there is what we describe as the reactive approach, where a communications team within a major enterprise is confronted with a crisis, and now they have to decide how to react. If they do not have existing processes in place, they may be challenged to build out a monitoring process from scratch, sometimes in near real time, in order to capture earned media and relevant content for your business and your objectives. One may be challenged to develop the workflows associated with these processes and to assign accountabilities for who is responsible for executing which step of the process. There's an additional challenge in terms of developing the distribution channels, figuring out which key stakeholders need to know which information at which times, and developing the appropriate forums to communicate this to them. The downsides to this approach are that one may experience unanticipated process, workflow, and staffing issues in the course of crisis monitoring. There may also be unclear stakeholder mapping if this was not defined before a crisis occurred. The net result is that the communications team may have a slower reaction time. Now, we think we can remedy this with what we call the proactive approach. Critically, a proactive approach means that monitoring processes are put in place before a crisis occurs. It means that workflows and accountabilities are set ahead of time and preparation done ahead of time. And the appropriate distribution channels are already there. So when a crisis does happen, your team is able to react quickly. The upsides to this process are that you can stress test the workflows and the processes during quote unquote peacetime before a crisis occurs. Clear internal stakeholder mapping means that none of your executives or relevant stakeholders will be left wondering what's the latest development, because they will already hear it from you and your communications team. The net result to a proactive approach is that you can have a faster reaction time if and when a crisis does occur. So why does this matter for your business? We think it matters on two dimensions. One, in terms of advancing the specific communications objectives of the communications team, and the additional implications for the broader enterprise. In terms of key communications outcomes, a proactive approach allows you and your business to detect threats early. And this allows your team to respond to this with greater lead time than you would had you taken a reactive approach. The combination of these two means that your enterprise is able to avoid or mitigate these reputational threats before they occur or as they are occurring. As well, your communications team is able to demonstrate clear value and connection to the bottom line of your enterprise. PR crises are pleasant for nobody, but preempting them and responding to them quickly is broadly appreciated throughout the organization, which leads us to some of the broader benefits to the enterprise. With this proactive approach, your communications team can facilitate an integrated crisis response across numerous business functions. As I mentioned earlier, these reputational threats often come with additional implications for business strategy, operations, marketing, or any core function within the enterprise. To mitigate those reputational threats and the knock-on effects is a clear benefit towards those other functions. And as well, in a crisis, a reputational threat sometimes comes with legal or regulatory implications. Faster response on behalf of your communications team will allow an accelerated response in the legal and regulatory functions as well. And as alluded to, aligning the principal stakeholders, keeping them abreast of developments, making sure there are no surprises to the degree that that's possible is an obvious benefit to any communications team. So with having presented this basic argument, Mollee will review a framework for crisis monitoring that we've developed. Over to you, Mollee.
Thanks, Julien. So monitoring during a crisis is crucial. There's no doubt about that. However, next slide, please. Media monitoring has value before, during, and after a crisis, not just during. And we're going to go over the benefits in each stage of a crisis. Next slide. First stage would be before. Having media monitoring in place before a crisis occurs allows for early identification of a crisis, which in some cases can help prevent it from occurring altogether. For example, not all crises begin in a national outlet or through a social influencer. When crises begin in smaller outlets, early detection can help take control of the narrative before it reaches national level, which will also help prove to your stakeholders how a communications team really can benefit your organization's bottom line. Having media monitoring in place before a crisis also allows for a longer lead time for action. So you're starting ahead of the game instead of behind the ball. We kind of tend to think when a PR crisis occurs, you have a shortage of two items, a shortage of time and a shortage of information. By having a monitoring platform or system in place before a crisis occurs, you're already ahead of that game because you got the information as soon as it happened. And now you have more time than you would have if you were starting behind the ball, learning about it after the fact, after a reporter reached you, for example. So if you're not worried about or spending time on setting up media monitoring, then your team will have more time to focus on the actionable next steps, which will help mitigate that reputational risk. Next slide, please. During a crisis. Now, during a crisis, like we said earlier, there's no doubt about it, media monitoring is a crucial part of your communication strategy. Because half the battle during a crisis communication situation is staying informed, it comes as no surprise that media monitoring has value during a crisis. During a crisis, media monitoring can be used to identify drivers of coverage, provide insight into the progression of the crisis, guide your crisis communication responses, and assess the situation through visibility of messaging, activating and/or identifying influencers, and then, equally as important, keeping your C-suite informed. Next slide, please. Following a crisis, you should always assess the effectiveness of your crisis comms response. We tend to think of this like a postmortem to determine what can be done better next time and to update crisis comm strategies accordingly. This kind of in-depth analysis would also bring to light new opportunities such as audiences, new partnerships, new messaging styles, etc. For example, information gleaned from media monitoring during a crisis can reveal journalists who might be interested in writing about your organization in the future. You may also learn of niche audiences you didn't know existed before. And then next slide. Another reason why having crisis monitoring in place following a crisis, media monitoring in place following a crisis, is because there's typically a long tail to a PR crisis. PR crises don't have a specific end date. There's always residual media and social interest, which can sometimes prolong the crisis or revive it down the road. New developments, no matter how small, can always resurface old news and crises. And adjusting to this new normal media environment means monitoring for crises after they've passed. For example, I had a professor who worked for a very top PR agency, and one of his clients was a beverage client. They had a poster as part of their communications campaign, they had a poster in a general area that just so happened to have underground dogfighting. No one knew about that, obviously, when they placed the poster there. But somehow, an attendee of the underground dogfight took a picture, which included the poster of the beverage company in the background, and it steamrolled social media. And everyone was saying how this beverage maker supported underground dogfighting and people should boycott all of their products, and it just really kind of took a turn. Thankfully, the communications team was able to grab hold of that narrative, put the right information out there, and that helped a lot. But the problem is, as I think all of us are realizing, nothing on the internet dies. So all of a sudden, a random social post will happen again where it brings up the original post, or someone will see it and they won't know all the information that's happened since that original post. They just see the original post that came out that correlates the beverage company with underground dogfighting. And so having media monitoring in place for that company is crucial, because they need to essentially have key terms, just like a hold on that narrative. So whenever it starts to resurface, their team can go in and correct the narrative. Next slide, please. So putting it all together, we treat this framework as our best practice, because before a crisis really helps you in some ways prevent crises from happening, gives your team more lead time for action, so that way you can come up with cohesive, consistent messaging. During a crisis, that really just helps you understand how the narrative is developing, helps you understand key players, who you should reach out to, and allows your team to focus more on the aspects of actionable next steps. And then whoever's running your media monitoring can in turn keep track of the developments, keep your team informed, which will then allow you to keep your C-suite informed. And then following a crisis is really just best practice to see, there's always room for improvement, and to help you learn what strategies should be improved, what worked fantastically, and what should be put in place for next time. Next slide.
Now, having reviewed the value of a proactive approach and a framework for crisis monitoring, we'd like to review some best practices that Cision has developed for putting this in place and providing your organization some actionable next steps. So, when it comes to the practice of monitoring itself, we've developed what we think of as a toolkit for all the necessary components you'll need to then implement in the scheme of an actionable workflow. The first is we recommend using some sort of monitoring platform. Now, it's perfectly fine, especially on short notice, to use Google and just consult news sources directly. But to have some sort of way to aggregate key content and sort through it and adjudicate it quickly is very important, even in a non-crisis period, but becomes doubly important when you need to act with speed during a crisis. And this platform should ideally have some sort of capabilities for both traditional news media as well as social media. So say you've got the platform, what do you do now? You need comprehensive sets of keywords and topics to capture relevant content. And when we say keywords, of course, simple generic keywords for a given industry are often helpful. And then obviously names of executives, names of key affiliates, any sort of content, any sort of proper noun affiliated with your business in any way would be very useful. And not only do you need the keywords, you need the broader topics, because oftentimes the keyword and the topic don't correlate one-to-one. So you need to have a predefined concept of what type of content you want to be pulling into this platform. Related to the keywords and topics, it's important to categorize the sources, the journalists, and the influencers that are going to be most important for your business. Sources, obviously, in terms of traditional media, you have national business news, but critically, industry sources often have the scoops that are missed by larger media, and as you'll see later, are oftentimes the source of some of this reputational threat. Of course, keep track of the key journalists that are covering your enterprise, and on social media, any influencers that are relevant for your business. Now, combining this all together, it's possible to do this in automated fashion, but for the most part, either communications professionals or trusted third parties need clear guidance on selecting relevant content in peacetime as well as during a crisis. Now, putting this into practice, it's important to predefine these workflows. And what I mean here by clear accountabilities is assigning this to relevant personnel and assuring that they have the appropriate training to act when appropriate to do so. And when we speak of a consistent search cadence, we mean that there should be a system, there should be a schedule for checking and adjudicating relevant content. It's possible to do it in ad hoc fashion, but it tends to be more efficient to work on a clear schedule to make sure that you are getting things quickly. And finally, some sort of editorial review is important for adjudicating relevant content for your business. Automated alerts go far in just getting stuff into your inbox, but what we've seen historically is that having folks with knowledge of the industry, knowledge of the enterprise, whether internal or third party, is going to be very important for triaging the relevant content. Now, you have your monitoring systems in place. How do you assess the broader media environment? How do you discern the trends that are affecting you and your enterprise, both pre-crisis and during crisis and after a crisis? Our recommendation is to have systems in place to develop quantitative insights from this body of information. And this has great value, whether before, during, or after a crisis. So before a crisis, assessing the nature of your media environment in a quantitative sense is very important for establishing a baseline for what your normal news coverage looks like. This is how many stories your company gets on over a certain period. This is what they get for special events. And this will allow you to assess a before and after of a crisis. Now, during a crisis, having measurement programs in place will help you visualize how things are changing. How is the volume changing of overall coverage? What is the quality of the coverage and how is it changing? What sort of key topics and key messages are being picked up in earned media or social media content? All of these are great topics to address with a quantitative measurement program. Especially related to key messages, this allows you to assess in near real time or a week or so delay the effectiveness of your messaging and to what degree news media and earned media is reflecting your messages. After a crisis, a quantitative measurement program allows you to engage in an in-depth analysis of your organization's response. How effective was the communication strategy? And from here, you can draw conclusions that you can take forward to manage either the long tail of the crisis or hopefully a return to a normal media environment. Combined with qualitative insights you get from having expert review of this content in your media environment, quantitative measurements are a potent combination. So let's review some essential metrics that your enterprise may want to employ when measuring a PR crisis. The first and most obvious is the volume of the news coverage. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying steady? And how does it vary over the key topics that are being tracked during the lifetime of a crisis? The second is the audience reach, which is a way to approximate how many potential readers were exposed to this information, to what degree, how many impressions were given to the audience. In a crisis, of course, typically has a negative connotation, especially regarding reputational threats. So how does the sentiment of the coverage change over time? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it neutral? And how does it vary? Finally, and critical for a communication strategy, it's important to note the key message pull-through, which is the degree to which the media environment is reflecting the key messages consistent with your communication strategy. Now, so say you have your monitoring in place, you have your measurement programs in place. How are you going to distribute this information? Who needs to know what? The first key step is to map the key stakeholders, whether that's C-suite, whether that's folks within communications team, whether it's in adjacent functions or separate functions, I should say, like marketing. It's important to keep these lists updated of who needs to know what and when they need to know it. Related to this, it's important to have clear ways to disseminate this information to them, and what I call here clear distribution channels. The point here is that executives at all levels are often inundated with communications from many different sources, by email, by instant message, and there are many different instant messaging platforms. It's important that the recipients of this information know who they're going to get it from and when they're going to get it. The net result we're shooting for is to keep all relevant stakeholders informed and engaged during the life cycle of a crisis, so that the communications team, well, there will be no surprises from your communications team. The media environment will always deliver surprises, but the communications team will be on top of it. Now, finally, we've done the monitoring, we've done the measurement. You have an idea of who needs to know what. So how is it going to be processed and refined for these executive audiences? It is possible to send raw news links and to let folks read and make up their mind for themselves. But these people are extremely busy, and oftentimes a crisis, PR crisis, may not be their number one priority. So how can you get the key information to them effectively? How do you distill it, package it for them? Now we have a list of deliverables here, arranged in order of the size of the actual deliverable, as well as the speed at which it can be produced. First, and perhaps most obviously, real-time or near real-time news alerts are very valuable for keeping executives informed, especially when communicating novel updates within a crisis to them. They may not need to know the entirety of everything that was said about the organization crisis related, but they may want to know the key updates. They may want to know when key spokespeople were mentioned. And this can be captured in taking the raw news link, adding some executive summary to it, and passing it on to the stakeholders in quick fashion. As well, we have rapid response coverage reports, which will summarize, or rather collate, the relevant coverage and typically include an executive summary to make sure that the executive knows that this is the breadth of coverage, crisis related, that was captured over a couple of hours or a day or so, and here's why it matters to you. Regarding the measurement reports, it's also possible to engage in a quantitative analysis of a given body of collected media and pass this on to the key stakeholders, letting them know that here's how the sentiment changed or didn't change. Here's how the volume is changing. Here's how the key message pull through is changing. In terms of daily briefings, this is often a substitute for some of these coverage reports, but it's also complementary as well. First thing in the morning, providing the relevant stakeholders updates on the key topics that have been covered, especially those that are crisis related, can be another valuable tool. And finally, related to the post-mortem Mollee alluded to, one can also do after-action coverage and measurement reports to assess the effectiveness of your communication strategy and design the next steps that correspond both with your communication strategy, but with the broader business enterprise. Now, these deliverables can be conducted in-house or done with a third party, but the recommendation is that some sort of processing on behalf of the communications team should be done before passing it on to other executives within the organization. All right, now, Mollee, I believe we're over to you for some real-world case studies.
Thanks, Julien. So we've made the case that a proactive approach to PR crisis monitoring stands to benefit your entire enterprise. We've reviewed the phases of a crisis and then given some of our best practice recommendations. Now we'd like to present some real-world client examples. All cases have been de-identified for the privacy of our clients, but the principles at play offer valuable insight. Next slide, please. So just wanted to give a quick overview of each of these case studies before we go more in depth. The first one we have today is for a major healthcare enterprise. Breaking news from an industry outlet proliferated into the national media, but a proactive approach allowed for early detection and rapid response. For a major pharmaceutical company, setting up a social media monitoring program showed how crises can have a persistent, although manageable, effect on your media environment. Then we have the example of a regional utility company. A reputational threat demonstrates the enduring influence of local media outlets. And then our last case study for today is a major automotive manufacturer turned a reputational crisis embedded within the lovely 2008 financial crisis from a threat into an opportunity. Next slide. So our first case study is from the major healthcare enterprise. To set the scene here, this healthcare client is a highly diversified Fortune 500 company. However, their PR crisis began in an unusual way. I think most of us, especially in the setting of this webinar, for example, think of PR crises as large, prolific, visible threats in, national media outlets. But the case of this PR crisis came from breaking news from a small industry outlet. This industry outlet alleged bias in a new company algorithm. Now, the company faced two primary challenges in the immediate aftermath following the breaking of this news. Although the news broke in a small industry source, national outlets were quick to pick it up by later in the day, like later afternoon, evening. And the main risk here was a reputational threat from highly sensitive and charged allegations. Next slide. Now, the monitoring solution for this crisis follows our framework. Real-time news alerts were in place prior to the crisis and alerted the company to the negative coverage. Comprehensive coverage reports were added for the duration of the crisis to keep stakeholders informed. Now, guidance for both of these monitoring solutions were to focus on novel developments to the storyline. And this alludes to what Julien spoke about earlier, which is the editorial review process. This is incredibly important, establishing how you want that editorial review process to look prior to a crisis, because then you have that added layer of human insight that technology can't quite reach yet. And it highlights to your team and stakeholders the new information, how the narrative is developing in a way that artificial intelligence just doesn't have the ability to. Now, the monitoring solutions benefited the business outcome in the following ways. Early detection of the original industry outlet story allowed for rapid response to subsequent coverage. For example, that early detection of that first tiny industry outlet, which we would argue isn't necessarily one of the top healthcare industry outlets either, allowed the communications team at this healthcare company to pull together those consistent, cohesive messaging that were then included in the national pickups of the coverage from big key players like New York Times and Washington Post. And the ability, having that extra lead time, having the ability to kind of gain control of that narrative allowed the team to mitigate the reputational threat. Next slide, please. So, bringing everything full circle here are the key takeaways from this case study. Having monitoring in place before a crisis begins enables early detection and rapid response. Like we said earlier, there are pretty much two shortages you're always going to have in a PR crisis, and that's time and information. You're always going to need more time to gain control of that narrative, and you're always going to need more information than what you have, because we live in a world that's just an influx of information all the time. So having that monitoring in place before a crisis allowed them to be alerted to the crisis before it gained traction, allowed them extra time to determine how they wanted to respond, and then allowed them to mitigate that risk because of it. This case study also shows that national outlets are not always the original source of reputational threats. Those are the ones we think about a lot, but they're not always the original source. And then once again, kind of pinpointing that value of editorial review for identifying novel developments. When you have that human overlay or human insight overlaying the automated processes, you are better equipped to inform your stakeholders, to inform your team about those novel developments than if you were having to cull through automated alerting like Google Alerts, for example, because those will give you so many false positives or just continue to alert you to pickups of the same exact story. Whereas where you have that editorial review in place, then you're able to really pinpoint the actual development of the crisis itself. So you can determine are our team's messages permeating the way we wanted them to? What's the tonality here? What should our next steps be, etc. And then Julien, I'll kick it to you.
Thank you, Molly. So for our second case study, we'd like to review the story of a major pharmaceutical company that came to Cision to develop a pretty novel social media monitoring solution. One of the key issues we discovered early in this process is that their social media environment was experiencing a great deal of what you would call continuing coverage of old allegations against a former executive. And these were very sensitive allegations that had occurred several years before, but they were a persistent feature of their monitoring environment. So the key challenge here was how to create an integrated social and traditional media monitoring program that was able to weed out some of the old allegations from what was novel reputational threats or the novel key messages. This program wasn't developed with a crisis specifically in mind, but was certainly useful for triaging a lot of this content that was resurfacing. So the solution that we developed combined both real-time media monitoring and daily briefings, all for an executive readership. So communications leadership was involved as well, but the ultimate stakeholder that we were shooting for was to keep the C-suite of this company informed. And so we leveraged some advanced social media monitoring platforms in addition to our systems for monitoring traditional media. The key here was developing clear thresholds and parameters for assessing the relevance, for trying to determine what was going to warrant the interest of this company's executives versus what was probably below that threshold, and establish clear guidance and editorial review focusing on novel developments in this old storyline that involved the former executive. Some of the develops in this novel storyline where the former executives had an affiliation with a politician. And whenever news was focusing around this politician, social media, especially Twitter, would then bring up these old allegations against the former executive. So as analysts, we had to figure out what is new here. Is there a substantive update to this storyline? Is there novel information that the journalist or the social media influencers are bringing to light, or are they just simply restating something that was old? Something that is useful about social media, especially Twitter, are the built-in quantitative thresholds for followers, retweets, etc. But sometimes they may be misleading, because what may be like a genuine reputational threat in terms of a novel allegation may come from a fairly low influencer, low follower account, whereas sometimes these spectacular kind of claims that are ultimately unsubstantive get hundreds or thousands of retweets. So it was a delicate balancing act of figuring out what was relevant for the company's executives and, of course, keeping the communications team abreast of new developments. The outcome from this monitoring solution was we were able to detect some novel reputational threats coming from Twitter in particular. There was one instance where I remember someone developed a very negative sentiment video surrounding this former executive, now embedded within a tweet. So this video wasn't necessarily making new claims, but its reformatting of old claims was something that was worthy of informing the executives. And finally, in terms of business outcomes, we were able to keep the communications teams and the C-suite of this company aligned on these novel developments. And we had multiple distribution channels for making sure that everyone who needed to know did in fact know. As far as lessons learned, I think this is a clear case study in the long tail to crises that we've discussed throughout this presentation. Oftentimes, old allegations can come up in new and unexpected ways, but the simple rehashing of old allegations is not necessarily worthy of your time and attention. It's also a case study in some of the challenges in developing an effective social media monitoring solution and trying to develop the key thresholds to make sure that the C-suite was kept informed. Back to you, Mollee.
Thanks, Julien. Trying to be mindful of time here. I know we want to leave about 10 minutes for the Q&A session, so I'm going to try to breeze through my example because I think Julien's next example with the automotive company is a great one to discuss as it brings in the measurement side of things. So bear with me and hang on for the ride. The third example here is focusing on a local subsidiary to a regional utility company. Specifically, this example highlights the enduring influence of local media. Essentially, the parent company of the local subsidiary and the local subsidiary had a third-party affiliate who was receiving some very negative backlash, and news media was tying them into that third-party affiliate coverage. Now, the interesting part here, that the reason we wanted to discuss it as a case study, is the subsidiary's local audience, local news, took more interest in actions of the third-party affiliate and how it was tied to the subsidiary company than larger news outlets did of how it impacted the parent company. The company primarily faced two challenges during this crisis. Local media focusing on the subsidiary ties instead of the parent company's ties to the third-party affiliate, which created a reputational threat from highly sensitive and charged allegations. However, because of the local media focus, the subsidiary was more uniquely positioned to respond to this crisis than the parent company was. Next slide. Monitoring solutions that were in place for this crisis. So we implemented intraday coverage reports for the subsidiary. There were a few things to just highlight about these intraday reports. These reports were not company specific, as in it focused on any mention of the third-party affiliate's actions and not just coverage that mentioned the subsidiary by name. That was because they wanted to see when the third party was mentioned with, not by name, but utility company in such and such region. They also wanted to see what other companies who had been affiliated with this third party were being dragged into the negative coverage. And then consequently, because they were casting basically a wider net than the smaller focus on how is our company immediately affected. These reports included both a regional and national focus, which really allowed them to get a comprehensive view of how this narrative was developing. And that was also important, or this is also important to highlight, because there are times where you want to cast a much smaller net so you can see what's happening, how your company's reputation could be impacted. And there are other times where to truly understand how the narrative of this crisis is developing, the speed as it's snowballing, so to speak, you need to cast a much broader net so you can get that comprehensive view. Lastly, the intraday reports also included social media engagement, which helped the subsidiary to track how their local community was engaging with the news. We also had human overlay here, where they would, using our comprehensive social media platform, they went in, analyzed all the data, pointed out peaks in coverage, pulled out key tweets, for example, of what was driving coverage on social media, so that way the local subsidiary team could focus, instead on gathering information, they could focus on, okay, this is what's happening in our local community. How do we act now? Now, as far as how did monitoring impact the overall business outcome, the intraday reporting helped the local team rapidly respond to subsequent coverage, which mitigated that reputational threat in its local communities. Once again, tying back to that experience of you're always going to have a shortage of time during a PR crisis, and having this monitoring packaged and sent to your team truly allows your team to focus on the more important step, which is what actions do we need to take? What should our messaging be? Who is driving the coverage? Like, who should we reach out to, etc. Next slide, please. So key takeaways for this case study. The local subsidiary is another example of the long tail to crises. The naturally slower cycle of local news media combined with the social media engagement kept this crisis in the news far longer than what the parent company experienced. Once again, the enduring influence of local media is no joke and can still have an impact on your organization's reputation. It's important to remember that during a crisis. This case study also highlighted when using a holistic monitoring approach, casting that wider net may be more beneficial than using a novel development monitoring approach. Julien, I hope I left you enough time.
We'll be fine. And for our final example, we'd like to review the case of a major European car maker that was confronted with a multi-dimensional crisis as part of the 2008 financial crisis and recession. So in terms of challenges, the company was facing an unfavorable financial outlook amid this broader economic uncertainty. And in the news media, there was rising negative sentiment regarding the company's financial prospects and broader mostly financial prospects and their ability to compete in this environment. To make matters worse, the media coverage was favoring their competitors in terms of positive sentiment, both before and at the start of a crisis. So in terms of monitoring solutions, the client worked with Cision to develop, I believe it was monthly and quarterly coverage and measurement reports to track the effectiveness of their communication strategy. They were able to get eyesight on the volume and sentiment of earned media about their own enterprise versus their competitors. And critically, they're able to track the key message pull-through in the international business media. The key finding from this monitoring solution is that the client was focusing on messaging around their strategy and vision going forward. And this had been established before the financial crisis even began. The company decided to continue doing that. And they saw that the news media coverage had a very positive sentiment around their strategy and vision, whereas their coverage of general corporate enterprise and financial performance lagged. So what this allowed the client to do was to decide to continue projecting confidence in their own strategy and vision. And eventually, after 6, 12, 18 months progressed, media sentiment of the client themselves recovered to pre-recession levels. And furthermore, their media sentiment was now outpacing their competitors. In terms of lessons learned, this is a case where monitoring was able to enable decision-making at the highest level. It allowed the alignment of communication strategy with the client's broader business strategy. And having had these systems already in place, the client was able to respond immediately. And that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation, where we make the argument that a proactive approach to media monitoring advances your communications objectives, poses benefits for your entire enterprise, and unlocks opportunities before, during, and after a PR crisis. So I think we have roughly 10 minutes for the Q&A. Please, before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to direct you to the console for which there are many additional resources available. And now we will take a look at the questions. First of all, there was a question to the effect of, why can't I conduct this media monitoring process internally? What is the value of outsourcing this to a trusted third party? And the answer is quite simply in terms of resourcing and capabilities. The process we've described here is very effective at mitigating reputational threats to your enterprise, but it's often a very labor-intensive process. And communications teams are focused on key messaging and communications strategy, whereas this monitoring program is often best conducted with a third party who operates functions independently and is always ready to produce these deliverables for your client. And the folks such as in Cision Insights are subject matter experts within these fields and in this particular function. So instead of asking a communications generalist or a junior communications specialist to conduct this, it's often very effective for our clients to work with Cision and have the confidence that the deliverables will always be of the highest quality and deliver 5, 7, 365 days a week, however, whatever is required for your business and for your communications team. Mollee, do you see any questions you'd like to address?
Yes, we have a lot of great questions.
Great questions.
Another question is, my company has never experienced a crisis. Why would I need monitoring? It's an excellent question. Essentially, I think part of our motto is always be prepared, kind of the Boy Scout motto in that way. And times are just, you never really know what to expect. For example, we had clients who had never necessarily experienced a crisis before, and then COVID happened, and suddenly they were thrust into the limelight as part of larger narratives because maybe their company took slightly longer than others to conform to new regulations or just new times. So really having that monitoring in place beforehand can prepare you for any of that. And then even if your company's not prone to crises, which I hope all of your companies here are not for your sake, it's just good to have monitoring in place because then you can truly get a grasp on how your industry is doing in the large landscape of media.
Thank you, Mollee. We've gotten a number of questions, specific questions about potential trials or pricing, and we greatly appreciate your interest. We would like to direct you to, I believe there's a box called Speak to a Cision Expert, and if you're able to reply yes in that dialog box, we will contact you directly. And again, we greatly appreciate your interest, both in exploring those options as well as for joining us in this webinar today. But as far as additional questions, there was one, Mollee, that was actually very pertinent to our old role in the media alerts team. Let me see if I can find it. Well, before then, we got a question about the editorial review process. Is this essentially reading the full content to ensure you pick up on content, tone, etc.? Yes, and more than that. It is not only assessing the full text of the content to pick out the key bits that are relevant for given stakeholders or relevant for the enterprise overall, but it is not only about assessing the content itself, it is also picking out that particular story within the broader media environment. Because the larger the enterprise, the more media coverage you'll receive, and it becomes more important to engage in a systematic review of that content on a consistent basis. So I hope that addresses that question. I believe Mollee may be experiencing some technical difficulties.
I think I'm back now. Julien, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
We apologize.
What question are we on now? Yeah, I think we lost Julien now. Okay, Julien, I'm not sure which question you're working on, but you look very passionate about it from the screen I can see. Okay. I think Julian's gonna refresh and connect. We have another question. Obviously, no one can predict the future, but is there a way to tell beforehand and thus best utilize the pre-crisis monitoring? That's a great question. I think this really goes back to the editorial review process. You have those subject matter experts in hand who have really learned through experience and background what the normal landscape, so to speak, looks like. And then they're able to understand the level of crises, so to speak. So they're able to help identify a crisis before it starts, which is always our number one goal as a team. And they're able to help speak to it as it progresses. And then I think otherwise, most of the time, our clients can tell us when they're experiencing a crisis if they don't have monitoring processes in place prior to a crisis happening. And then we have a whole host of team able to sort of identify best key terms. I think that was another question further up. Let's see. Beyond the typical keywords, are there other keyword terms to combine with your organization for relevance to potential crises? Another great question. Essentially, there's a really difficult balance to come up with between how wide of a net you want to cast for key terms. You need to be sort of vague enough to have weird, vague situations come in to your searches without being too specific that then, let's say, a crisis you never would have foreseen happening would be weeded out in that process. So it's a very fine line that we have experts who work hard with your team to develop what those are. And unfortunately, going back to the editorial review, that's one of the reasons we always suggest having some layer of human insight, because you're going to get a lot of false positives. I mean, Julien and I both know that very well because we would essentially cull through false positives all day for our job when we first started here at Cision. I think we are running out of time here. So you have so many good questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to answer them all. But if you want, please feel free to, once again, just hit that, contact decision expert, because all of our personnel are more than ready to help you answer these questions to the best of their ability. We work with small organizations, Fortune 5 organizations, so we understand the needs that are unique to your goals and priorities as an organization. Julien, am I missing any sign-off details here?
I just want to note that the presentation will be recorded and distributed, and we had so many great questions that we would like to follow up in email afterwards. So we appreciate everyone taking the time, and I know we're running over. Y'all are extremely busy communications professionals, and please forgive my technical difficulties. I have no idea what happened. I was looking forward to answering more of these, but we really appreciate everyone showing up, and we wish everyone a great day.
Thank you, everyone.